Welcome all listeners and viewers to another episode of What's the Day Live. Today I'm joined by Reverend Cheryl Kincaid, and she's joining me today to commemorate the International Day for the Prevention of Violence Against Women, which is celebrated annually on November 25. Before we dive into the day itself, to tell you something about what's special about this day, November 25th, 2024, the United Nations is planning a 16 days of activism starting from November 25, and this will go until December 10th, which will conclude on the International Human Rights Day. So the theme of this activism, 16 days of activism, is all about every 10 minutes a woman is killed. Hashtag no excuse, unite to end violence against women. So this is the whole campaign that the UN is planning to run this year, going into next year, which marks a special commemoration of 30 years of the declaration of the Beijing Accords, where it was a special document which came out for girls and women for declaring their rights, specifically on a global platform. That aside, we've got Reverend Cheryl Kincaid with us, so who's a Presbyterian Minister. I hope that is the correct way to say it. And I'll give it to her just to tell us about what she's been doing in the space and what she loves to do.
So thank you so much for having me, first of all. I have worked with survivors of incest and rape and violence for many years. Currently, I'm a minister, so my primary job is preaching the gospel. But in that, I find frequently women who are stuck in violence and women who use scriptures and religious traditions to stay there. And so almost my specialty is dealing with people of faith that are stuck in this violence, seeking long-time healing from the scars, because you keep the scars many years after you leave. If you grew up 20 years in a home that was emotionally and physically violent, and you were trained to survive by being submissive to it in some way, shape, or form, you don't suddenly walk out of that house and make a new life. You carry with you the behavior patterns and the sense of what feels like home is what feels like violence. And so oftentimes you find yourself in the same situation that you just got out of. So I've written a few books on the subject, and I talk to women essentially using the scriptures, because they've had the scriptures used against them to beat them down, to tell them that it's not appropriate to stay, that there are better ways to live, and that it's even Christ honoring to leave. And that you can call violence against women sin. I know that seems like a no-brainer to some of you listeners, but there are some women who've been taught that their job is to exist for the sake of the man, and their job is to exist to keep harmony in the household. And actually, the scripture teaches that women were created to enjoy the pleasure of God, not to enjoy men necessarily. And they were created in the image of God, equal to man. And I start there and work with women on those two subjects.
Right.
And some part of it is educating that I don't want to say normalize, but I want them to understand that what's happened to them is common. I like the word common as opposed to normal.
Okay.
It's happened to a lot of women before you and men. It's going to happen to a lot of women and men after you. And some of the symptoms that you have, the nightmares, the flashbacks, the floating anxiety, some of those are going to follow you in your life. But that doesn't mean you're unhealthy or that you're crazy or you've got mental issues. It simply means that you're human. And this is the way that humans deal with stress once they've been in it for a very long time.
Right. So you talked about this family structure, right? How growing up and things like that. The UN also mentions that every 1 in 3 women has faced some sort of violence across their life.
Yeah.
The family structure itself, right? While across cultures, it is difficult to raise the topic of violence in the family, be it Christian, Hindu, Sikh, or some other form.
Yeah.
Do you have any tips that you give your the people that you work, the women that you work with, as to how they can raise that, or you work with family members who are having these problems in their life, right? And what would you like to tell them as to how can they raise this topic in the family if they
in
see
the family
somebody,
system.
yeah, in the value system?
I think once, one of the simple things you can tell people across faith lines is that it's a good thing to obey the law of the land.
Mm-hmm.
That what is happening is illegal.
Right.
And you can do that across the lines. Now, culturally, and all religious cultures have this. All the history of humanity has this. Women have been viewed as chattel for many years. You paid a bride price for her. You bought her. So there was this sense that, and that's across all cultures. It was a dowry in the West, but it was the
Yeah.
same thing. But teaching again, learning people to rethink the idea that that your wife is your companion, she's not your possession. I
Correct.
think that's something that goes across all lines, and also that people. One of the great joys of being in ministry, I'm celebrating 20 years of ministry, but before then I was working in violent situations. So when I was working with women with violence, I saw a lot of unhealthy marriages because that was my specialty. Now being in the ministry, I've been able to witness some very good marriages as well. And what I have noticed, which is a similar factor in every marriage that tends to be a marriage that holds up through the years,
Mhm.
is the companionship is emphasized. That there's this sense of that this is my best friend and my counselor. Or even if they're not your best friend, they are your best confidant.
Mhm.
And within that is a sense of equity. You divide the labors up. And because it's difficult for one person to do it all. And
Mhm.
and so you respect each other's gifts in that equity. You respect that someone can do something better than you can. And you divide up the responsibilities. Um, and what women have been beaten up across all religions is this idea of obedience, the idea that they're not fully human. And I think it's just kind of the evolution of humanity. So, in every religious type, you can find the teaching that there's equity between the two. But humanity wants to define it in a power structure where
Yeah.
one is better than the other and one is greater than the other. So teaching them to look at their own religious literature differently,
Mhm.
and educating pastors and Sikhs and rabbis and other people in the faith and counselors that let's not look at it that she is not a full human being of her own right. That's part of it. But you can start with the law of the land because we can all agree that if we live in a world where the law is not obeyed, we have chaos. No one wants chaos. And you simply talk about there are certain laws that are created because we as a society, people as a society, have considered this is detrimental to the raising of children, to the preservation of private property, and to the
Correct.
preservation of commerce,
Mhm.
and the preservation of morality. And violence is one of those things that societies all around the world have said
Yes.
it doesn't work.
Yeah.
Property gets destroyed, children get abused, and they carry those scars into adulthood and can't be functioning adults. And so I always encourage people to obey the law
Mhm.
and and to go ahead and say, you may not be able to sync it with what you've been taught in your religion now, but eventually you will be. But this is illegal and it's got to stop. And some of the things that I encourage women to do goes across all ethnicities, groups. But I encourage them, first of all, to find what your resources are. So violence has a pattern to it.
Yeah.
Um, it breaks out, and there's some violence, and then there's the making up period because he doesn't
Mhm.
want to lose the woman, and there's passion and love doing that,
Yeah.
and then until the next violent episode. So
Agree.
when times are good, there's a couple of things you need to do. You need to go down to your local library and you need to get a Gmail or an email that he doesn't know. Because if you the email you're checking on your phone, because violence is wrapped in control and power, he's got all that information. Most libraries in the United States, you can create your own email there for free with Gmail. Or you go to a friend's house if you don't have a library, but you need to get your own email and your own Google search engine, so he can't search your Google search engine. Find out what shelters will take you and your kids and your pets. So when the violence breaks, you'll have some place to go. One thing I remember my father saying to my mother, and I was shocked to hear Oprah Winfrey say that she heard a man say this to her mother when she was a little girl, is when she said, "I'm going to leave," he laughed and said, "Where are you going to go?"
Right.
And that's a common thing that are said to women. So have a place to go. Plan that ahead of time. Find out what shelters are out there. Have a friend that can take you in at the last minute while you look for a shelter. Make plans and keep property over a friend's house. Keep a certain amount of money, a certain amount of property, so you can get out and you can go. So I often encourage women, especially one with pets, not all shelters take pets. Find out which shelters take pets. And you can do that all online, but don't use your home computer because he will check that. So that's one plan to make. And it's hard to set aside a little bit of money, especially if he's controlling all the money. But find a way to have your own money in the form of a Visa card that you buy at Target or another store, and you're going to keep it in a hidden place. So if you need to take a cab or you need to spend the night in a hotel, you got that money too. The unfortunate thing about violence is I'd love to say you just need to go home and your parents will side with you. That doesn't always happen because some
Yeah.
predators are very good at triangulation. And they want, and some parent, and I think all parents want the marriage to work. You want your kids to be happy. You want it to be a home without divorce. There's still a certain amount of shame with divorce. You want all that stuff. And sometimes those prejudices or those values come against her protection. So if your home's not a safe place, you need to find a shelter. But another reason I want to encourage women that are listening to me to find a shelter as opposed to going home. Predators are violent people. They don't like to lose their control.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes women leave, they get killed, or people they love get hurt. Go to a place where he can't find you. He's going to go to your mom's house to find you. He's going to go to your best friend's house to find you. If you have a shelter where he can't find you, or you know a very cheap hotel where you can stay a few days till you can find a shelter, maybe in a different city where he can't find you, that's going to help you to get out. I know a lot of people that shame women when they say, "I just can't get out." And I don't want to shame any woman. There's something that's very real called the trauma bond. First of all, I'll say there's something very real called love. I believe in romantic love. I believe it's real. I believe it's powerful. And especially if you've been intimate with a person, that's real. They can win you back. They can push your buttons. But beyond that, there's something called the trauma bond or Stockholm Syndrome.
Yeah.
And that happens to prisoners of war, that they go under trauma with their torturers and they get this bond with them. So when the war is over, you find these prisoners of war protecting their torturers. This happens in marriages all the time. So when women say, "I can't leave yet," I say, just start to make plans to get away until the violence quells. My goal, I'll tell them honestly, is I'd like you to leave. And I know it's going to hurt, and heartbreak hurts, and it happens over all kinds of reasons. But lots of people get their heart broken. We know that by the testimony of many country western songs.
Mm-hmm.
And they live. They go on. They go on to have career. They go on to have self-worth. They go on to raise their kids. And this may have been the only man that you can love. I believe that's true in some cases. But that doesn't mean you have to live with the violence. You can figure out a way to live apart from him after you get the law to protect you. Law enforcement agencies don't always protect women for lots of reasons, sometimes because of their own bigotry, but sometimes because the woman keeps going back. And one of the things I tell women is you've got to prove it, especially if the police have been called more than once, that this time you're going to stay away. You'll be protected more if you can prove that. And kind of just letting the person go. Um, it's rare for someone who's grown up in violence to break that pattern, but people
Yeah.
do. But he's never going to break it as long as you stay with him. That's definitely true. And so getting out and keeping your children safe. I tell women all the time, you won't be held accountable to what was done to you as a child. You had no choice there. You will be held accountable as to what you let your children go through, and the law will hold you accountable. So now you have a legal obligations to get out and stay out.
So, yeah, you've given us a lot of information as to steps women can take and things like that. And we talked about how we can probably get out of the situation. And then, but from a prevention perspective or a confrontation perspective, right? As in the family, if somebody is going through this, obviously escape or getting out of it is one way to look at it. If we want to prevent it at the grassroots level, right? Uh, what would you suggest for family members to take up if they're bystanders in the situation where they're not one of the victim or the perpetrator itself, and they're looking at it from a third party perspective? This
Yeah.
is specifically a family situation, but obviously the bystander effect takes more force and form when it's in a crowd, when it's outside. But from a family perspective, since we are in this conversation, we're getting into this direction. Probably we could look at it from that perspective where relatives or parents, if they see something like that happening, what should they be highlighting, right?
I think, well, first of all, you want to not try to work with the abuser.
Yeah,
Even if you like the abuser, you've got to say, dude, I like you personally, but I'm going to keep her secrets.
yeah.
Say, I can't talk to you about that. It's
Mm-hmm.
okay to say, I simply don't know.
Mm-hmm.
She's not here though. So one thing is protecting her that way. Um, Encouraging her that a hit is a hit is a hit,
Yes.
whether it's a shove or whether it's well, it was just a slap or it was just a pinch.
Mm-hmm.
A hit is a hit is a hit.
That's
I
right.
think one of the things I try to tell people all the time is that women who've been violated often say, well, that's the way men are, is to have men who are workmates say, I'm not that way.
Right.
I've never hit my wife.
Mm-hmm.
I've never wanted to hit my wife. I've gotten angry at her and left the room. I've yelled at her because we were mad about something, but I've never raised my hand in that way to her. Uh, Teaching other males to model that behavior,
Mm-hmm.
um, and teaching adults as they enter into marriage, ask if there was violence in their childhood, and let them know that that's going to have an effect in their adulthood. And it's good to seek out support groups and counselor groups.
Yes.
Um,
Yes. For
and there are all kinds. I mean, I've encouraged more than one couple in my pastoral chamber to go to Debtors Anonymous if they have money problems, because couples fight about money and they fight about intimacy. Those are the two things they fight most about. And later it'll be child rearing as well. But I say,
Yeah.
get that money thing under control.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you're going to have conflict anyway, because, conflict's a part of any friendship, especially between two people who are intimate. But in that, learn to deal with your conflict in a civilized fashion. And
Mm-hmm.
there's wonderful books, one called How to Fight Fairly, books about how to resolve conflict. But I think as a society as a whole,
Mm-hmm.
not just having women speak of it, but have men speak up about it too, that women don't deserve to be treated that way. The word politically correct has been used in a derogatory term.
Yeah.
And I've encouraged people to say, I'm not talking about political correctness, I'm talking about right and wrong. And this is wrong. It's wrong to treat women this way. It's wrong to, you can't really love someone if they're just an object.
Yeah.
You know, you really want a friend, and that's just practical. Anyone knows that as in a marriage situation that that illness and age and different things can get in the way of intimacy. That happens in marriages all the time. But there needs to be that core confidence and friendship. And that can't be there if there's not mutual trust. And violence violates it. So we got to stop normalizing it. And I think we've done better at that. I know, you know, if you watch old sitcoms like I Love Lucy, Ricky spanks Lucy. We couldn't do something like that today on TV, and that's good. Women speak up more for themselves in the spousal role now. So, but going ahead and normalizing it, and I always say, fathers, be good to your daughters, because she's going to choose a man like you.
Yes.
So, you know, love your daughters and treat her with respect, and point out when you see a man treating a woman poorly to your sons and your daughters. We don't treat women like that in this family. We understand that, and I've talked about equity, but there's a reality too that men are physically stronger than women. And I get a little annoyed at the television shows that show the women beating up the man who's just about ready to attack her. And that's great entertainment. It's not real life, and it does damage for women who've been attacked. The reality is that chances are he was stronger than you and you couldn't do anything. You did the best you could to keep yourself safe. But teaching sons that you want to treat her with integrity, but treat her like someone who's not as strong as you. The Apostle Paul calls it the weaker vessel. I know some people take offense at that term, but he says treat her with respect as a weaker vessel. But I would say treat her as someone who's not built physically the same as you. So, you know, you may shove your best friend when he makes a joke, but you're not going to do that to your wife.
Right.
Or to your mother. So I think there's a lot we can do in just training each other. And I think another thing that's really important is we got to stop laughing at jokes about the differences between men and women. I mean, the differences between men and women are differences I believe God gave us to be enjoyed. So that we can turn to each other. A man turns to a woman and a woman turns to a man, and they say to each other, you have differences, and in your differences, I have things I can enjoy from your perspective that I don't see, and you have things to enjoy from my perspective. They're not differences to be competed with or to be ridiculed or to be put down. And we know that already with in the United States, racial jokes are no longer acceptable.
Right.
And they used to be at one time. You could hear racial jokes from the pulpit at one time. That's no longer acceptable. But you can still hear jokes about the differences between men and women. And the reason why racial jokes weren't acceptable is that within them was the threat of violence, was the legitimization of violence, which happened in this country through Jim Crow laws. And through the horrible tradition of lynching, not just slavery, but lynching. That was real. And people thought, because you're different, I can ridicule you. Well, the same should be true with women and men. We don't ridicule each other's differences. We enjoy them. We may not understand them. And with our spouse, it may be somewhat dear to say, oh, you're going into your man cave now. And that can be a joke between you and your spouse. But don't make a joke at it so he's ridiculed in front of your friends.
That's right. Yeah.
And the same thing with your wife. You know, if she takes a long time to get ready, it can be almost endearing to say, you're beautiful already. Why do you do this? I want to do it. But when her friends come, you don't make a joke about that. So it's learning how to enjoy our differences as opposed to putting them down. but also keeping our eyes open when we have a friend who has bruises all
Yeah,
the time. And and being the listening ear when they tell you, and just saying, I really like your spouse, he's my friend, but you need to figure out a way to get out of the situation until you figure out what's going on.
that's right.
And I think as a culture, we could do so much if we would just empower people that they don't deserve that kind of behavior.
Mhm. So this jokes not being acceptable, you've raised a very good point, right? There's a very fine line between humor being humorous and it being derogatory, and then it basically leads to violence, as you mentioned, right? So on that point, I want to give the listeners and the audience flavor as to what the history entails for this day itself. So I'll just tell everybody as to how the day itself came to birth, right? So November 25 basically marks the assassination of the three Mirabal sisters who were activists, political activists in the Dominican Republic in the 1960s. Their assassination was ordered by the then dictator of the country. And then in 1981, the activists of the Latin American and Caribbean feminist encuentras, they came up with the idea of November 25 being marked as a day to commemorate their assassination of the three Mirabal sisters, to combat and raise awareness about violence against women. Now, what happened that on 20th December in 1993, the United General Assembly passed a resolution of 48 by 104, and which talked about the declaration on the elimination of violence against women, and it paved the way for the whole pathway and the vision for this whole thing. In finally, for the whole movement to take form, right? In 7th February in 2000, in the year 2000, the United General Assembly said that fine, they adopted a resolution called 54 by 134, and they said that we officially recognize 25th November, which has been going on for the past 20 years, as the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. So that's how the whole history is. It's been around for like 40 years. People have been talking about it and things like that. Now, if you talk about the whole society as a whole, right? Now, and there is so much literature and governments working for it, and societies, NGOs working for it. But there is still so much stigma of the whole thing, right? But you've also talked about women, once they're victims, once after the violence has passed, one is the factor of submission in the family structure itself, and then there's also the part of trying to make them forgive, right? You've talked about that, and these are two topics I think probably we could touch upon a little, so that people know that submission does not equal violence, and then forgiveness does not mean that violence has been accepted, and it does not approve of any future violence or something of that sort, right? If you could tell the viewers something about that.
Yeah, so I want to just talk about the difference between forgiveness and denial. And I'm going to use my
Mm-hmm.
tradition, but I know that forgiveness is in all faith traditions.
Mm-hmm.
In order to forgive someone, you first have to admit that they did something wrong.
Mm-hmm.
You have to, so in the Christian tradition, it's if you confess your sins, he's faithful and just to forgive us our sins and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. So it begins with a confession.
Mm-hmm.
And in order when you admit that they did something wrong, you have to admit the full scale of what that wrongness did to you. And the result of true forgiveness, if it's a violator, is caution, because now you understand. You say, you really hurt me, and so therefore I need to be cautious among you.
Yeah.
Forgiveness is not wanting to continually to punish them for it. So in the Christian tradition, we give that anger to God. We say, God, he belongs to you. You punish him. I can't. But it doesn't necessarily mean reconciliation.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't want people walking around gritting their teeth in the back of their mind, telling this guy off for the rest of their life. That's a fantasy. That's not forgiveness.
Right.
And that doesn't really help you. I think we have this idea that because we've read too many novels and seen too many shows, that I can go into a villain's home and just tell him what he did to me, and that's going to wound him, and he'll stop, or that'll hurt him back. That doesn't work. So you give up the idea that you have to fix them. You just give them to your I sense of the to your sense of the divine. And then what you do on your side is you say, I have to be cautious, but I'm not going to be angry anymore. And you release that anger when it comes back to you. Now, you still can do everything you want to protect yourself. Jesus talks about cutting your hand off if it causes you to sin. You can cut him off, and you can have a sense of serenity here on this earth. And so you should still try to protect yourself, but you can't walk around your whole life trying to punish him. The second thing that you can't do is you can't generalize. So this man hurt me, so all men do this. Well, that's not true. I wish more men would speak up and say, I don't do that. I would never do that. And to give voice to that would be very helpful. But not all men do this. I can trust a man again because men and women have more in common than they have different. We're both human beings. We're both mammals. We both work really hard. We both have dreams. We both have unanswered questions and wounds and joys and hurts. And I think that men and women were designed to live with each other. So we can't just cut off one gender in our society completely. Um, so I would say that you learn not to generalize anymore.
Yeah.
And go ahead.
I mean, those are great insights, right? I mean, for the audience and for the world itself, we've cut across cultures to talk about why violence is a problem, and there are ways that you can escape. There are ways you can confront, and although we've not talked about from a society level, we've talked about it on the fundamental family level, right? And thanks for that. Thanks for joining me in. We had Reverend Cheryl Kincaid with us talking to me on the podcast on What's the Day Life. Thanks to you, and thank you to the audience for listening in. And if you have some comments, if you want to join in the conversation, do leave it in the comments. If you like it, do give a like and do follow and subscribe. Thank you so much. Thanks for being there with me.